Hello and welcome to Westminster Watch with me, Nick de Bois. This week we're here in Downing Street as we await the election on July the 4th. Behind me is the famous black door of the British Prime Minister's residence. The question is, who will be walking in there on July the 5th? Coming up, we will have the analysis of two expert economists as we try to unpick the party's pledges. We're also looking back at the moments that got us here, the key policies, the places and people that will decide this election. Before that, here's the story of the election campaign so far with our reporter, Tom Sullivan.
The Labour Party hasn't been behind in the polls since 2021, and it appears their position is only getting stronger. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak needed to have a perfect election campaign, but he didn't get off to the best start.
The question now is how and who do you trust to turn that foundation into a secure future for you, your family and our country?
And things seem to have only gotten worse from there. His Conservative Party has tried promising many things: national service for young people, tax cuts for the self-employed, even flying illegal migrants to Rwanda. But nothing has seemed to move the dial. Instead, the Tories find themselves outflanked on both the left and the right. With the Lib Dems having an unexpectedly strong election campaign under their leader Ed Davey, and Nigel Farage re-energising his Reform Party by returning as leader. You don't need to be a polling expert to know the Conservative Party is now in deep trouble.
You have to go back to December 2021 for the last time the Conservatives were ahead in any published poll. And you have to go to September 2022 for the last time that they came within single digits of the Labour Party. So the gap has been considerable now, 4 years. And going into the election, the expectation was that perhaps based on historical precedent, that gap would close. It's estimated that around about a third of people make up their minds, or at least have done in recent elections, make up their minds during the campaign. So there was, and indeed still is, all to play for. But actually the opposite, if anything, has happened. And the gap between Conservatives and Labour has increased.
But ultimately, as the saying goes, a week is a long time in politics. And the only poll that really matters is the one on the 4th of July.
One of the places that will define this election is the so-called Red Wall. It's a series of seats across the Midlands and north of England that were historically left-wing and left behind. They voted heavily in favour of Brexit in 2016 and 3 years later voted Conservative to get Brexit done. Boris Johnson's other big promise for this part of the country was to level it up with public spending equivalent to that lavished on London and the South East. Earlier this year, we travelled to Hartlepool to gauge whether voters there still felt left behind. So you voted Conservative, and could you bring yourself to vote for them again at this election?
Yes.
So you'll stick with them despite your disappointment?
Yes, because to be perfectly honest, I don't think there's a government in waiting, if you want to put it that way.
What are the top issues that'll be going through your mind when it comes to marking that X?
So the main issue is trust. They're promising everything, they're not following through with it. It's always the same case on everything.
So is it fair to say that you're disappointed with politicians, but you're still prepared to give them another chance?
Yeah, there's always hope. You can always pray for hope.
So many boats came over the channel with 400, 500 people on, and it's every day, and you don't see thingy where they don't seem to be doing anything whatsoever about it. And then they're putting them all up, and I think it creates tension.
Does it really matter who gets in? Because all we're fed with is lots of promises and no results.
This election will be the first one that all British people can vote in following a change in the law that allows those who've lived abroad for more than 15 years to cast a ballot. But are Britain's expats ready for a new government? Do they really even care? We went to Alicante in Spain to find out. What about the change in the law, Andy? That means if there was another referendum, all expats would have a say.
Yeah, and I think that's what should have been in place 8-9 years ago. It really, really frustrates me, and that's why I've got no interest in voting in this upcoming election. I think the passing legislation is too little too late, and I firmly believe, as an expat living in Europe, not just in Spain, if we've been allowed to vote in the referendum, that has had a bigger impact on our lives than any UK election.
It's not just the general public who are wondering whether to vote Conservative. Even some of the Tory MPs we've interviewed are having second thoughts.
When you go in that ballot box, could you vote Conservative?
Well, this is really difficult. I've always been Conservative my whole life. But what are the things that the Conservatives offer today that make them different to the Labour Party? It's very hard to answer that.
Do you think you could really vote Conservative with that record at the next general election?
Well, I think the alternative is worse.
So that's the reason you might vote Conservative?
Yeah, I think, and lots of people will.
The reasons most people vote Conservative are relatively straightforward and clear, and they don't really apply. We've been there for 13 years. You know, you and I were there together for some of that. And I don't think most Conservatives would feel that they've got much from the party that they've supported.
One of the main dividing lines in the Conservative Party has been immigration. Now, over the course of this Parliament, net migration soared from 170,000 to 768,000. The vast majority of these people are arriving legally, while a smaller number of people are arriving irregularly by sea. Nearly 30,000 last year. But that's been a huge talking point for right-wing parties, with the Conservative Party passing legislation to remove these migrants to Rwanda, where they would then be able to apply for asylum. But it's been thwarted, and no flights will take off before the election. And unless the next government leaves the European Convention on Human Rights, they may not take off at all, as our correspondent Alex Barker explains.
It was all smiles and handshakes when the Rwanda policy was born. This was over 2 years ago now, when then Home Secretary Priti Patel signed a deal with the Rwanda government. The agreement was that the UK could send some asylum seekers to Rwanda while their claims were processed, and if an application is successful, they will be granted asylum in Rwanda. The government said it would put people off making the dangerous crossings over the channel in small boats if they knew they wouldn't be allowed to stay in the UK. As the Prime Minister put it,
Stop the boats. Stop the boats. Stop the boats. Finally, stop the boats.
The first flight was on the tarmac ready to go in June 2022, but a last-minute intervention by the European Court of Human Rights kept it on the ground. Since then, it's the UK courts that have held things up. A group of asylum seekers challenged the policy. The first court ruled it was lawful, but the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court, the highest in the land, both said the scheme was unlawful because of concerns over how safe it would be to send people to Rwanda. So, another handshake, another signature by another Home Secretary, now James Cleverly. This treaty addressed some of the court's concerns. It makes sure anyone relocated to Rwanda can't be sent back to a country where their life or freedom would be in danger. It also established new bodies to hear individual appeals and monitor Rwanda's asylum system. At the same time, the government had introduced an emergency law to definitively label Rwanda as a safe country, no matter what the courts might say. It made it through the Commons easy enough, despite some Conservative rebels saying the bill doesn't go far enough to stop the European courts getting involved again.
This bill needs to work. It is our last chance. If we get it wrong, the British people will not forgive us.
Then came the House of Lords' turn. This didn't go so well.
All people, asylum seekers included, are of great value. We can, as a nation, do better than this bill.
What on earth does it do to the credibility of His Majesty's government when in the international conventions across the globe it stands up and lectures other countries about the importance of adhering to international law, of the importance of adhering to international conventions, when it passes a law which explicitly states that with respect to the Rwanda Bill it doesn't have to?
They've defenestrated domestic courts, gaslit the Supreme Court.
Parliament can pass a law saying that all dogs are cats, but it doesn't make all dogs cats. Parliament can pass a law saying that Rwanda is a safe country, but it doesn't make it a safe country.
They sent it straight back to the Commons, asking for MPs to make some changes. That was the start of the so-called ping-pong between the houses. Thrice more it was sent to the Lords, and thrice more it was returned to the Commons with requested amendments. Constitutional convention means it is inevitable that it will become law, though, no matter how unhappy the Lords may still be with it.
One of the privileges of this job is getting to meet people at the centre of the biggest political stories. One of my most interesting guests was Lord Alf Dubs, who in 2016 managed to change the law to help stop migrant children being separated from their families. Now, he actually came to the UK as a refugee himself during the Second World War. He fled Prague just before the Nazis arrived in the city, and he came to England on the Kinder Transport, a rescue mission to get Jewish children out of Nazi-occupied territory. I sat down with Lord Dubs just before the Rwanda Bill became law. When the first announcement of the Rwanda policy was made, how did that make you feel?
Look, bluntly, it's not going to work. I don't think it'll deter people, because I've been to Calais, I've met people coming over. I hate the traffickers, they're awful people, but there's got to be a better way. I don't think the Rwanda policy will work, and I think it's a bit of a mess, frankly.
Many people will say that the illegal migration into the country is a problem that has to be dealt with. You've said you don't think Rwanda will work. What do you think would work?
Well, can we get in proportion? Last year there were about 600,000 net migration into this country, of whom between 30 and 40,000 were refugee claimants. So we're talking about a tiny proportion of the total. Yet all the policy, all the venom is directed against people who are asylum seekers. And I repeat, coming across the Channel in a boat is a horrible experience. It's dangerous. The traffickers are vicious people who take money for subjecting people to danger.
And they are, the government would say, the target of their law, to actually break, if you like, the business model. Do you have any sympathy with that?
I have sympathy with the government's wish to break the business model, but I don't think this is the way to do it.
Let's take a look at the party's key pledges in more detail. As well as that promise to send migrants to Rwanda, the Conservatives say they will cut national insurance again and increase defence spending. Labour are promising to nationalise the railways, reform windfall taxes on energy companies, and end private schools' charitable status. The Lib Dems want to rejoin the EU single market and change to a proportional voting system and guarantee people to be able to see a doctor within a week. Reform UK say they freeze non-essential immigration, cut taxes for small business and scrap net zero targets. And the Greens will cancel university tuition fees, implement net zero by 2040 and dismantle the UK's nuclear defence system.
So how much will all this cost? While the traditional big three parties have produced relatively restrained spending pledges, that's not the case for the Greens and Reform UK. All these parties say they will raise more than they spend. But how realistic is that?
To answer that question, I've exchanged the front door of Downing Street to the embankment overlooking the Houses of Parliament, where I'm joined by economists Vicky Price and Catherine McBride. Thank you both for joining us here on Westminster Watch. Let me kick off, if I may, with you, Catherine. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have said there is effectively a conspiracy of silence amongst the Conservatives and Labour on the true extent of tax and spend policies. Is this just disingenuous by the politicians, or is it showing a lack of willingness to tackle the real problems facing the country?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. I think they know that they want to get elected, so they don't want to say your taxes are going up. But they have said that which taxes they will not increase for working people. And they've been very hard to find out who they consider to be working people and who isn't. Rachel Reeves has been quiet on it, but Wes Streeting gave the game away. And it seems if you have any kind of savings at all, you're not a working person, which is not good. But interestingly, they will get more money in tax just because we have fixed the thresholds. So as inflation continues, even though it came down to 2% today, which is great, but it's still going up. So as wages increase, they'll get more tax that way.
I suppose, Vicky, the question is, as economists, are you disappointed that, if you like, not everything is on the table, or do you just expect that? And therefore, I would ask you, what do you think the plans are, or what is needed, more importantly, to drive the growth that the country needs?
I think the most important thing is a bit of stability, because we've seen so much uncertainty and instability in terms of the number of prime ministers we've had in the last few years, and also the number of people who are running departments and were responsible for the economy. So that will help, certainly. I'm not at all surprised that we don't have any details in terms of what the plans may be.
Doesn't that frustrate you, though? Because I know voters must be frustrated, but you're economists. You presumably would like to be able to map out things if you knew which taxes were likely to go up and which weren't.
Indeed, I think we'd love to see that, to be able to calculate what the implications of that would be. But I don't think the various parties really know themselves, because the Labour will tell you that they have to look at the figures in a little bit more detail. We have not had a spending review, so we don't actually know what the various departments had been planning to do and what the pressures on them are. And that's really why everyone is worried. We concentrate a lot on taxes, but we haven't concentrated enough on what the spending profile is likely to be. For the moment, the spending looks completely unrealistic, which both parties are contemplating. So it's bound to be thrown out of the window, and we're going to see more spending. The real question for everyone, and for most economists who are looking at this, is where is the money going to come from, and are they in fact, whoever is in power, going to have to raise taxes in the end?
So, Catherine, is the alternative to spending a return to austerity for whoever gets into Parliament? And is that did austerity work before, and would that be a sensible thing to do, to look at cutting spending rather than raising taxes that you may not have said you're going to raise?
I'm a big fan for cutting spending. I think that there's quite a lot of things they could do. There are several areas where with one hand we're taking money off people in taxes, and with the other hand we're paying them in-work benefits or something like that. There are a lot of things in government that they could cut, but they will also benefit a little bit by getting the economy to grow if interest rates get cut. I would love to see them cut on Thursday, but they probably won't be cut before August, and that will actually get the economy going a little bit, which will give people more. If their mortgages come down, they've got more spending money, they might spend that, which would be good for businesses, which will pay more taxes, etc. So there is a way to raise money without just redistributing wealth, taking it from A to B.
So it would be a political decision, obviously, if you were to increase taxation that you said you might not do, or cut spending. But one thing every party is saying actually in this election is we're going to collect more money from tax evasion. I mean, I'm getting on a bit. I've heard that at every election. The Conservatives have been in power for 14 years and they're now discovering they can find money that they can claw back. Labour is saying the same thing. How credible are those claims?
Not hugely credible, but the truth is that there is more money which is collected every time there is a big effort to do so than would otherwise have been the case. It doesn't actually fill the black hole you still have on whatever it is that you'll be receiving either now or in the future, because I mean that is a very, very difficult path to rely on, if that you're going to get that money and therefore you can actually start spending. You need to make sure you do get that money before you do spend it. And it is a question mark really in terms of what happens to our public services. There is no doubt that they have fallen quite substantially in terms of the quality that is delivered, and people don't like that. Well, I think one of the reasons why they may vote in a different way this time and won't change is because 80% of the population in the latest poll that I have seen think that public services in the last 10 years have really, really declined quite significantly in terms of what it is that they provide the people. So that is a big, big issue. If you start cutting that, then that's going to be a major issue. Yes, of course, Catherine is right in saying you can look at various areas of spending and maybe cut some of the things that are being done inefficiently right now. And there are plans to invest a lot more in the National Health Service to improve productivity. But it's very, very hard if you have drained various public services of money for a very long period of time. You just can't, by even putting some extra investment in, get some amazing efficiency improvement.
Okay, so you're depressing me so far because I'm not actually getting a picture of optimism from either of you, but I am getting a realistic assessment. So let's look up. Labour Party particularly, and the Conservatives, and probably the rest, all are talking about growth, that they are going to deliver the growth to help pay the bills so they don't have to either cut or even raise other taxes. That's certainly Labour's mantra. Can any government really engineer growth? Isn't that down to trade and business and enterprise and investment?
Well, there are ways they can improve trade, which we've actually seen. The Conservative government has cut tariffs on goods we don't produce. And they did that in the last 3 months of their government. They should have done it in the first 3 months of their government, but that's, by the by. And they've also, as I said, as interest rates come down, that will help. But they've also got to look at our business taxes. The Conservatives put business tax rates up. They haven't changed business rates for local businesses either. That could be a way of helping people grow.
What about the labour supply in this? Because for all the talk of growth, you've got, and I'll turn to you on this if I may, Vicky, you've got all this talk about engineering growth and wonderful plans, but we've got 9.5 million economically inactive. They want to reduce immigration. Who's going to do the work?
It's a very good question. We have had very high immigration, no doubt about that, and the fact that it had been promised to come down after we left the EU simply hasn't materialised. But of course it has helped businesses who needed that type of inflow of people. It's been more expensive than if we just got the EU workers coming. Now indeed you get growth either by improving productivity or by increasing the number of people at work.
Well, productivity is a sorry story though, isn't it, in this country so far? And actually, is immigration and low wage the answer to improving productivity?
Well, not all of our immigrants are actually here to work. A large proportion of the ones that the 700,000 that are coming here are students, and they actually pay very heavy fees, 3 times what our local students do.
So that's quite productive.
And they actually, the National Universities Organisation, whatever their official name is, they think each student adds about £100,000 to the GDP. So that's a good immigration, if you like, in terms of keeping our university lecturers, love them or hate them, employed. Pushing up rates in our rents in our university towns, which a lot of UK students are not happy about, but that's good for landlords, I suppose. So it's not all bad immigration, and I think that we actually have a higher, because we can say what industries come in, how much they have to earn, etc. Many people thought the earnings were too low. But by saying, well, if you're a chef, you can come in on 24,000 or whatever, that's probably the going rate for a chef. So they were looking at the industries because they got in a lot of people in health and care.
But Labour are talking about upping the living wage. 2 economists from, I think it's HBOS, have said this actually could have a negative effect on the economy. In a word, are they right?
Well, loads of firms have already expressed some concern about that, the hospitality sector, because of course they employ people at the minimum wage. But we've got to think, if we're thinking about redistributing and making sure that this is a fair society, perhaps the wages that were being paid before, a few years ago, before the minimum wage was actually introduced, were far too low. And so far the minimum wage hasn't really had a negative impact, but some sectors are affected more than others. But I have to just add something on the immigration front.
Yes.
Yeah, that not all labour which comes in is sort of cheap labour. Right now, of course, quite a lot of it is highly skilled people. And even before, and if you look just around us where we are now, the construction sector depends so hugely on immigration, and a lot of it was coming from the EU. In London in particular, I think there's been a big issue about costs now.
Vicky Price, Catherine
can I
McBride.
actually agree?
I'm afraid you
Oh,
can't.
we've run out of time.
It's good to know you were agreeing at the end, but thank you very much for joining us here on Westminster Watch. And thanks to all my guests for joining us here today on Westminster Watch. And don't forget, for more lively debate, subscribe to our YouTube TRT World channel. But in the meantime, from all of us here on Westminster Watch, thanks for joining us and goodbye.